January 1945. Germany was collapsing under its own weight. Snow lay thick over the wire fences of a prison camp called Stalag 9, near the small town of Ziegenhain. The war was almost over, yet for the men held behind those fences, there was no sense of peace, only hunger, fear, and the endless wait for someone else's decision. Inside the compound, American prisoners stood shivering in the pre-dawn cold. Their breaths hung in the air like ghosts, silent proof that they were still alive. Orders had come down from the German guards. All Jewish soldiers were to step forward. No reason given. No explanation needed. Every man there understood what that meant. The stories from the East had reached even these fences. Those who stepped forward might never be seen again. Among the prisoners stood a man from Tennessee, Master Sergeant Roddy Edmonds, senior non-commissioned officer of the captured Americans from the 106th Infantry Division. He had been a soldier long enough to know that obedience kept men alive. But this order was different. This one reached deeper than fear. The German commandant barked again, louder this time, his pistol visible at his side. The sound cut through the winter air like a whip. The line of Americans wavered, eyes moving from one to another. No one spoke. Some prayed silently. They knew the math. To step forward meant death. To stay still might mean worse. Edmonds took one breath, then another. In that moment, leadership meant more than stripes on a sleeve. It meant deciding whether hundreds of men would live or die, and how they would be remembered if they didn't. He stepped ahead of the formation, boots crunching on the frozen ground. The guard stiffened. The pistol came up, pointed straight at him. Behind him, hundreds of soldiers waited for his next move. Some Jewish, most not. All watching one man test the boundary between law and terror. Edmonds met the officer's stare without flinching. His voice was calm, southern, firm enough to carry across the yard. "We are all Jews here," he said. The words hung in the air, heavy as the silence that followed. The officer's hand tightened on the pistol. For a heartbeat, no one breathed. The only sound was the wind threading through barbed wire. That single sentence defied an empire built on fear. It was not shouted, not pleaded. It was spoken as fact, simple, immovable, undeniable. In that instant, every man in that formation understood what courage meant. Not medals, not guns. Just the refusal to be divided by hate. History records the place, Stalag 9, January 1945. The senior NCO of the American POWs invoked the 1929 Geneva Convention and refused to obey an unlawful order. The officer hesitated. The gun stayed raised, then slowly lowered. The prisoners held their line. That morning, 200 Jewish Americans stood under the same gray sky as their brothers in arms, and lived. Because one man, unarmed and freezing, decided that the law and conscience still mattered even here, even now. Before that frozen morning in January 1945, Roderick Roddy, wearing Edmonds, was not a man anyone beyond Tennessee knew. He was born on August 20, 1919 in Knoxville, the eldest of 4 sons to Thomas C. Edmonds and Jenny Sexton Edmonds. When Roddy was not yet 3, tragedy struck. His mother died suddenly, leaving his father, a paper hanger and decorator, to raise 4 boys alone during the Great Depression. They lived modestly in South Knoxville, where Roddy learned early about responsibility and quiet strength. He attended Flanagan Elementary, then Boyd Junior High, and graduated from Knoxville High School in 1938. Teachers remembered him as polite, serious, and loyal, never loud, always steady. After graduation, he worked as a stock clerk at a local store. But in March 1941, with war spreading overseas, 21-year-old Roddy enlisted in the United States Army at Fort Oglethorpe, Georgia. He trained hard, advanced quickly, and soon wore the chevrons of a master sergeant, a title earned through discipline, not age. He qualified as an expert marksman with the carbine and sharpshooter with the rifle, leading Company A 164th Infantry Replacement Battalion during stateside training before being assigned to Europe. By December 1944, he was deployed to Belgium with the 422nd Infantry Regiment, 106th Infantry Division, known as the Golden Lions. Only 4 days after arriving, the German army launched its final massive counterattack, the Battle of the Bulge. Edmonds and thousands of American troops were cut off and surrounded in the Schnee-Eifel region. On December 19, 1944, he was captured with his men and forced on a brutal 4-day march eastward to Stalag 9B, then later transferred to Stalag 9A near Ziegenhain, Germany. There, his rank made him the senior non-commissioned officer responsible for nearly 1,300 American prisoners of war, their order, their morale, and ultimately their lives. Inside the wire, Roddy Edmonds was no longer just a soldier. He was the line between chaos and command, a quiet leader whose faith, discipline, and sense of duty would soon be tested by a command that defied every law of humanity. Stalag 9 is sat on a low hill outside the German town of Ziegenhain, a maze of barbed wire and wooden barracks surrounded by frostbitten farmland. From a distance, it looked like a factory gone silent. Inside, it was a factory for waiting, thousands of men crammed into wooden huts built for half their number, sleeping shoulder to shoulder on straw sacks that reeked of damp and smoke. The winter of 1944-45 was among the coldest on record in central Germany. The men wrapped their greatcoats tighter and learned to sleep in shifts near the coal stove when it worked, and in silence when it didn't. Frost formed on the inside of the roof beams. The wind cut through the cracks in the boards. Every cough carried in the dark. Food came once a day, thin soup, black bread, sometimes potatoes if the guards were in a decent mood. Red Cross parcels were rare, cigarettes became currency, and the line between soldier and survivor grew thinner each morning. Dysentery, lice, and frostbite were as constant as the guard towers. The camp held men from across the Allied armies, Americans, British, Canadians, a few French. But it was the Americans, captured in the Ardennes, who made up the largest group. Their faces still carried the exhaustion of the march from Belgium. Hollow cheeks, cracked lips, eyes that watched everything. The German guards kept lists, always lists. Each week they called for names, professions, sometimes religions. They said it was for records. Everyone knew what it could really mean. Word spread quietly that in other camps Jewish prisoners were taken away, sent east, never to return. Fear traveled faster than the guards' boots. Edmonds, as senior NCO, became the invisible spine of the camp. He moved from hut to hut, checking that the men kept their discipline. He told them that soldiers had 3 things the Germans couldn't take: their name, their rank, and their serial number. Beyond that they owed nothing. It was not defiance. It was the rule of the 1929 Geneva Convention, the only law left standing between order and chaos. He kept those 3 words like scripture: name, rank, serial number. They became the rhythm of survival. Each roll call, each interrogation, each lineup began and ended the same way. Some of the younger men joked that the sergeant's voice sounded like a metronome, steady, certain, never breaking. The guards respected him more than they liked him. His German was rough but clear, his posture unflinching even when he was hungry and unshaven. They knew he held his men together, and that mattered. A disorganized camp was dangerous, for prisoners and guards alike. A disciplined camp could be controlled. Edmonds understood that balance better than anyone. He walked the perimeter at night when the others slept, listening to the wind hum through the wire. He had been in uniform long enough to recognize the sound of desperation. It was quiet, not loud. The kind of quiet that came when men began to lose belief in rules. His job was to keep that belief alive. Inside his coat pocket, he carried a small Bible. It had survived the march from Belgium, its pages wrinkled from rain. He didn't preach, but sometimes when the night stretched too long, a few men gathered near him just to hear him speak. Not about God, not about freedom, but about Tennessee, about food, about the way spring smells when the rain hits warm soil. He reminded them what normal felt like, because that memory was the only warmth they had left. By January, the rumor that Jewish POWs might be separated reached even his hut. The younger soldiers grew restless, whispering at night, asking what would happen if the Germans demanded names. Edmund's answer was the same as it always had been: you tell them your name, your rank, and your serial number. Nothing more. He said it without raising his voice, and somehow that calm was enough to silence fear, for the moment. He had no way to know that in a matter of days, that same calm voice would stand against an armed officer, and that those 3 words he drilled into every man would become the shield that saved hundreds. It happened near dawn, when the camp was still half asleep and the snow had not yet melted from the night's frost. The guards came in pairs, boots striking the packed ground in a rhythm that made men's hearts pound faster. Orders were shouted in clipped German, too fast for most to understand, but the intent was clear even before the words were translated. All prisoners were to assemble outside their barracks. Full roll call. Every man. No exceptions. They stood in the open yard, shivering in their thin coats, breath rising like smoke in the cold. A German officer, tall, wrapped in a black greatcoat, walked slowly along the front line, his pistol resting casually against his thigh. He stopped halfway down the row and barked an order that sliced through the silence. All Jews will step forward. The interpreter repeated it in English, and the words seemed to hang in the air like the smell of gun oil. No one moved. Not a sound. Every man in that formation knew what that command meant. The camps in the east were no rumor anymore. Men who had worked transport lines, guards who had served elsewhere, whispered what they'd seen. Jews taken from other camps didn't come back. The line trembled. One man shifted his weight, another tightened his fists. The officer's eyes scanned the faces, waiting. When no one obeyed, he barked again, louder this time. Edmonds stood in the front row near the center. His men watched him, waiting for direction. He could see fear rising behind their stillness, the kind that spreads fast when courage is silent. He took one slow breath, then another. He knew exactly what the Germans wanted. Names for separation, obedience for control. He also knew what the law said. The 1929 Geneva Convention allowed prisoners to give only their name, rank, and serial number. Religion was not required. It was not their business. He turned his head slightly, catching the eyes of the men around him. "Fall in," he said quietly. And just like that, every man stepped forward. The formation moved as one body, hundreds of soldiers, shoulder to shoulder, American uniforms covered in frost. From where the officer stood, it was impossible to tell who among them was Jewish and who was not. Edmonds had erased the line. For a moment, there was no sound but the creak of leather and the rasp of wind over the wire. The officer's expression shifted from confusion to anger. His hand went to his pistol again. But Edmonds didn't move. He stood at the head of his men, unarmed, unflinching, his breath steady in the cold. The Germans wanted division. What they got was a wall of unity. That single act, one command, one step forward together, would soon turn into one of the most remarkable stands of moral defiance ever witnessed inside a German camp. The German officer's patience snapped. He strode forward through the frozen mud, his boots crunching in the silence. The pistol came up, cold steel glinting beneath a pale sun. He stopped an arm's length from Roddy Edmonds. "Tell your men to identify the Jews," he said in clipped English, his breath fogging between them. Edmonds didn't move. Behind him, hundreds of American prisoners stood motionless, their breath rising in white clouds. Every heartbeat seemed louder than the wind. The officer cocked the hammer. The metallic click cut through the stillness like a blade. He aimed directly at Edmonds' head. "Do it," he hissed, "or I will shoot you right now." Edmonds met his eyes and answered without hesitation. His voice was low, steady, and certain, the tone of a man who understood both duty and law. "If you shoot me," he said, "you will have to shoot every one of us. And when this war is over, you will stand trial for war crimes. That is the law under the Geneva Convention." He didn't raise his hands. He didn't back away. He simply stood there, an unarmed American sergeant facing the barrel of a German pistol, speaking the language of law to a man ruled by fear. The officer hesitated, finger tense on the trigger. The wind pressed at his coat, carrying the smell of cold iron and damp wool. For the men watching, time seemed to stop. Then Edmonds spoke the words that would echo far beyond that camp, long after the snow and wire were gone. "We are all Jews here." No shouting. No bravado. Just 7 words spoken into the winter air, enough to turn the threat of violence into silence. The pistol stayed raised for a moment longer, then lowered. The officer's eyes flicked across the line of soldiers, every one of them standing firm behind their sergeant. No one stepped out. No one broke rank. That morning, in a German prison camp surrounded by wire and guns, the war's balance shifted, not on a battlefield but in a heartbeat of conscience. The yard went silent. The pistol stayed fixed on Edmonds, but the officer's eyes shifted. He looked at the hundreds of faces staring back at him, faces that would remember every detail of this moment. He knew what it meant. If he pulled that trigger, one shot could echo far beyond the camp. Every prisoner here was a witness, every name and serial number a line of evidence. The war was turning. Germany was losing. Trials were no longer a distant threat. They were coming. The officer's hand trembled. For the first time, he understood that the man before him was not afraid. Behind Edmonds, the formation didn't waver. Rows of Americans stood shoulder to shoulder, breath rising in unison. No one stepped forward. No one broke rank. They were one body, one defiance, one truth standing against a command built on fear. The officer lowered his pistol. Slowly. He muttered something under his breath, a word lost in the wind, and turned away. The guards followed, boots crunching on the frozen ground, retreating toward the gate. The sound faded into distance, first the echo of leather on ice, then nothing. Edmonds remained where he was, eyes still forward, his men behind him motionless until the last uniform disappeared beyond the wire. Only then did he let out the breath he'd been holding. Around him, the line held firm, 200 lives standing on the edge of death, now spared by a single sentence and the courage to speak it. No separation was carried out that day. No Jewish soldiers were taken from the ranks of Stalag 9A. When the roll was called again, every man answered the same way, by number, by name, together. In that cold yard, the gun lowered not because of strength, but because of law, unity, and a quiet southern voice that refused to surrender either. When the guards disappeared beyond the wire, the silence didn't break, it deepened. Hundreds of men stood where they were, uncertain whether to move, afraid the sound of a footstep might call the officer back. Then slowly they turned toward Edmonds. He gave no speech, no grand gesture. He simply said, "Fall out." The formation dissolved, boots dragging through the slush as the men returned to their barracks, shoulders still tight with the echo of what had almost happened. Inside the huts, the air was thick and stale. Tin cups rattled against mess tins. Someone tore a scrap of bread and passed it down the line. The stove hissed weakly, its heat too faint to matter. But for the first time in weeks, the tension in the room wasn't fear, it was awe. A few of the Jewish soldiers sat quietly on their bunks, staring at the floorboards. They knew the arithmetic of Nazi orders. They had seen what "step forward" meant elsewhere. This time no one had been taken. They were still here, alive, because one man had refused to divide them. No one dared to thank him out loud. Gratitude felt dangerous in a place where everything was overheard. Instead, it passed from glance to glance, a language without words. Someone whispered it later in the dark, the phrase that would circle the camp until everyone knew. The top kicked a gun out with words. Edmonds never corrected it. He didn't want the story to grow larger than the men who stood beside him. When one of the younger soldiers tried to praise him, he waved it away. "Keep your heads down," he said softly. "Follow the rules. Look after each other." That night, the barracks were still cold, but the fear had changed shape. The men slept closer together, not from hunger or chill, but from the quiet knowledge that courage didn't always shout. It could whisper and still be heard through walls of wood and wire. Edmonds sat by the dim light of a candle stub, polishing his dog tags with a scrap of cloth. He said nothing, but the men watching him understood. Their survival had been written not in gunfire, but in 7 calm words spoken against the snow. By the spring of 1945, the sound of artillery was no longer distant. It was moving closer every day. The guards grew nervous, their discipline unraveling with the front lines. Airplanes thundered overhead, and the men in Stalag 9 could feel the tremor of engines through the frozen ground. Then one morning it was over. The gunfire stopped. The gates swung open under the watch of American tanks from the 6th Armored Division, part of Patton's 3rd Army. Soldiers from Tennessee, Texas, and New York stood blinking in the sunlight as the flags of their captors came down. Roddy Edmonds didn't cheer. He was busy counting. He made sure every one of his men, Jewish and non-Jewish, was accounted for before he took a single step outside the wire. When the last name was read, only then did he let himself breathe. The war ended, but Edmonds carried none of its noise home. He returned to Knoxville, Tennessee, to the life he'd left behind before the Ardennes. His wife, his faith, his work. He didn't speak about the camp, not to his friends, not even to his family. The men who had been there knew, and that was enough. For decades, the story stayed buried under ordinary life. The Army records noted his capture and release, but nothing more. He never wrote about the confrontation. He never sought recognition. To him, it was a duty fulfilled, not a legend to be told. When he died in 1985, his service medals lay neatly folded in a box. No newspaper carried his name. His son, Chris Edmonds, was still unaware that his father had once stood before a pistol and spoken the words that saved 200 lives. The world moved on, but history has a way of waiting for truth to resurface. Years later, while sorting through his father's old army trunk, Chris Edmonds found a diary, photographs, and POW documents stamped Stalag 9A. Curious, he began searching through archives, reaching out to veterans groups, tracing the men who had been imprisoned with his father. That search led him to Lester Tanner, a retired attorney in New York, and one of the Jewish soldiers from the camp. When Chris mentioned his father's name, Tanner paused. His voice broke. "Your father," he said, "was the reason I'm alive." Other survivors confirmed the same memory. Erwin "Sonny" Fox, a broadcaster and fellow POW, gave testimony that matched Tanner's exactly. The words, the pistol, the snow, every detail aligned. They remembered Edmonds's calm, his refusal to single out any man, his invocation of the Geneva Convention, and his quiet command that united the ranks. Chris Edmonds documented their accounts, submitted them to the U.S. Holocaust Memorial Museum, and finally to Yad Vashem in Jerusalem. After a detailed investigation, The commission verified the testimonies and declared Master Sergeant Roddy W. Edmonds righteous among the nations, the only American serviceman of the Second World War to receive that title. The honor was conferred in 2015. A year later, a formal ceremony was held in Washington, D.C., attended by diplomats, historians, and surviving POWs. Tanner and Fox were there, men once young enough to be terrified, now old enough to understand the depth of what courage means. As the medal was presented to Chris Edmonds on his father's behalf, the audience rose in silence. On the screen behind the podium appeared a black and white photograph of Roddy Edmonds in uniform. The caption was simple. He risked his life to protect the lives of others. For 70 years, the world hadn't known his name. Now it did. And with it came the reminder that even in war's darkest hour, one man's conscience could hold an army of hatred at bay. The story of Roddy Edmonds is not written in battles won or medals earned. It lives in a single morning, a field of frozen mud, and a sentence that refused to die. One man, one command, one moment when fear met conscience and lost. The world had built walls of ideology, race, and hatred, and yet within those walls, one unarmed American sergeant stood and said no. He didn't draw a weapon. He didn't raise his voice. He spoke the oldest language of courage, law, honor, and humanity. For centuries, armies have marched under flags and slogans, but the men who change history are the ones who remember that rules exist to protect the weak, not to divide them. Roddy Edmonds remembered. He knew that decency was not suspended by war, and that uniform or no uniform, the measure of a man is what he refuses to do. In that camp, among those prisoners, he proved that leadership isn't rank or authority, it's moral gravity. He faced a gun and stood still. He defended others not by power but by principle. Because of him, 200 Jewish Americans walked out of Stalag 9A alive. Because of him, the idea of humanity walked out too. Decades later, when the medal was placed in his son's hands, it carried more than memory. It carried proof that conscience survives the coldest places. That the laws of men may fail, but the law within the heart does not. So when people ask what heroism looks like, it isn't always fire and noise. Sometimes it's the sound of a man's breath in winter, standing still before a gun and saying, "We are all Jews here." This is Shadows of Valor, where history's silence finds a voice. If courage still matters, subscribe and join us, one story at a time.